Walk into the Princess Louise in Holborn on any given evening, and you will see etched glass panels, carved mahogany counters, gilded mirrors, mosaic tile floors, and snob screens that allowed middle-class drinkers to hide from the working class on the other side. It looks like a perfectly preserved Victorian pub. It is not. Every one of those design features was invented for the gin palace, a type of establishment that Victorian moralists spent decades trying to destroy. They succeeded. Not a single original gin palace survives anywhere in London. At least, that is what the history books say. It is more complicated than that, because the thing the reformers most despised about gin palaces, their theatrical, ornate excess, is the only part that survived. It is all around you. You are probably drinking in one. How does a building type go from 5,000 strong to total extinction and still leave its fingerprints on every pub in the city? That story begins not with gin, but with a king's grudge against France. In 1689, King William III, William of Orange, ignited a trade war with France that would reshape English drinking habits for generations. Import taxes on French brandy, wine, and cognac became so severe that a gap opened in the domestic market. That same year, the government passed legislation allowing virtually anyone to set up a distillery with minimal notice and a small fee. The entire spirits industry was deregulated overnight. The spirit that filled the gap was gin, originally a Dutch juniper-flavoured drink known as Geneva. English soldiers had encountered it fighting alongside Dutch troops during the 30 Years' War. They drank it before battle. The phrase Dutch courage comes from exactly this practice. English soldiers brought the taste for it home, and now the law made it cheap and easy to produce in vast quantities. Gin production exploded. By 1720, approximately 1.3 million gallons were being consumed annually. The spirit was sold everywhere, from wheelbarrows in the street, from makeshift shops in cellars, from back rooms and doorways, and any premises that could fit a counter and a barrel. At one point, London had an estimated one gin distillery for every 4 houses. Gin became known as Mother's Ruin, and for good reason. By 1723, London's death rate had exceeded its birth rate for the first time in the city's recorded history. Gin was blamed for raising mortality, reducing fertility, and fueling the neglect of children across the capital. And the consumption kept climbing. By 1729, nearly 5 million gallons were being drunk per year in England alone. That works out to roughly 1 pint a week for every resident of London. By the early 1730s, production had doubled again to 10 million gallons, and the average adult Londoner was drinking approximately half a pint of gin a day. Half a pint, every day. The early gin shops, often called dram shops, frequently began life as chemists' premises, since the spirit was still associated with medicinal properties. Customers purchased their gin to take away or drank it standing at a counter in cramped, squalid rooms. These were not places of leisure. There was nothing glamorous about any of this. The gin craze was desperate, and it was killing people in numbers that alarmed even a city accustomed to poverty and death. Parliament attempted to intervene. The Gin Act of 1736 introduced prohibitive licensing fees, but it was largely ignored. Illegal production continued unchecked. Informers who reported unlicensed sellers were attacked by mobs in what became known as the gin riots. Anyone seen cooperating with the authorities risked a beating in the street. Consumption kept climbing regardless, and the act was repealed in 1743, a total failure. By 1751, the situation had become impossible to ignore. That year, the artist William Hogarth published his satirical engraving Gin Lane, depicting a London in total collapse. The central image shows a woman covered in syphilitic sores, dropping her infant into a gin cellar below while she reaches for snuff. Its companion piece, Beer Street, showed healthy, productive citizens drinking ale by contrast. Hogarth designed both prints explicitly to support parliamentary reform. The same year, the magistrate and novelist Henry Fielding, founder of the Bow Street Runners, published a pamphlet warning that if gin consumption continued at its present rate, there would soon be few of the common people left to drink it. The Gin Act of 1751 proved far more effective than its predecessor, partly because it was more cleverly designed. It raised duties on gin, but more importantly, it forbade distillers, grocers, chandlers, jailers, and workhouses from selling gin directly to the public. The trade was separated at its root. Large licensed distillers could sell only to licensed retailers. The backstreet cellars and cellar shops that had fueled the craze were cut off from their supply. Combined with a series of poor harvests that drove up grain prices and made distilling less profitable for landowners, the Act brought the gin craze to a close by roughly 1757. Consumption dropped sharply. London sobered up, slowly and reluctantly. The craze was over. Gin did not disappear, but for decades it retreated from public view. By the turn of the 19th century, the depravity of the gin craze had largely faded from public memory. A new generation approached the spirit with curiosity rather than fear, and gin underwent what historians have described as a gentrification. Old Tom Gin, a sweetened, botanical style, somewhat darker in colour and often barrel-aged, emerged as the respectable face of the spirit by the 18-teens and 20s. Old Tom was the gin served in polite establishments, and it was what the first gin palaces would stock. Meanwhile, a series of technological changes were transforming what was possible in London's built environment. Gaslighting had been illuminating the city streets since Pall Mall was first lit by gas lamps in 1807. By the 1820s, gas was becoming commercially available to shops and public houses. It was in this period that the first recognisable gin palace appeared. Around 1828, Henry B. Fearon, a wine merchant operating under the name Thompson and Fearons, opened what is credited as the first true gin palace near St Andrew's Church at 94 Holborn Hill, London. The building was designed by John Buonarroti Papworth, a prolific architect who went on to design many more. Fearon himself was no backstreet gin seller. He was one of the founders of London University. The building would later be demolished to make way for the Holborn Viaduct, and a drawing made shortly before its destruction shows a relatively restrained establishment, described by one historian as a tidy building, not the flamboyant palace of booze associated with later examples. Then, in 1830, Parliament accidentally created the conditions for gin palaces to multiply from a handful of pioneering establishments into a mass movement. The Beer Act of 1830 allowed any citizen who paid a fee of 2 guineas to obtain a licence to sell beer from their home. No further licensing requirements applied. The consequences were staggering. Over the 8 years that followed, 45,000 beer shops opened across the United Kingdom. That is more than 15 new beer shops every single day. Gin sellers faced an existential threat. They could not sell beer under their existing licenses. Their customers were being stolen, shop by shop, street by street. If gin was going to survive as a trade, its sellers needed to do something no beer shop could match. They needed to dazzle. And new technologies and fashionable rivals were arriving in rapid succession. Aeneas Coffey patented his column still in 1831, a continuous distillation process that produced purer spirits at greater volume and lower cost. That same year, Harvey Nichols opened its doors. Sheet glass was invented in 1832, making large plate glass windows affordable for the first time. Harrods followed in 1834. The silvered glass mirror, invented in 1835, brought mirrors to commercial scale. The raw materials for a revolution in drinking were all in place. The Gin Palace took the aesthetics of these fashionable upmarket shops and applied them to drinking. Vast plate glass windows flooded with gaslight, polished carved mahogany counters and fittings, etched glass panels and decorative screens. gilded mirrors running from floor to ceiling, ornate illuminated clocks on the external facades, Baroque and classical flourishes on the exterior, mosaic tile floors, sometimes inlaid with the establishment's name, island bars designed for rapid service from all directions, and a feature unique to the Gin Palace era, snob screens, which were etched glass panels mounted on rotating wooden frames, allowing middle-class drinkers to see without being seen by the working-class customers on the other side. Female staff, dressed formally, served gin from enormous labelled tanks behind the bar. The barrels were often labelled with humorous tongue-in-cheek names, not unlike the chalkboard menus of today. Gin was sometimes served alongside biscuits, cakes and other sweets. The effect was deliberately theatrical. Gin palaces borrowed from theatre lobbies and department stores, and they were positioned directly beside the worst rookeries in London. The contrast was the point. In 1835, Charles Dickens walked into one of these establishments near Drury Lane and described what he found. He wrote that it was all light and brilliancy, perfectly dazzling when contrasted with the darkness and dirt he had just left. He described the fantastically ornamented parapet, the illuminated clock, the plate glass windows surrounded by stucco. And he noticed that the most lavish gin palaces were always built closest to the most desperate slums. Inside, Dickens observed specific vignettes. A young man attempting to flirt with a worldly barmaid who flatly rejected him. 2 garrulous old women drinking rum shrub. The whole scene dissolving in a brawl of Irish labourers. These were real places, full of real noise and real life. Dickens published the account in Sketches by Boz, and it remains the most vivid first-hand description of a gin palace interior that has survived. For London's urban poor, the Gin Palace offered something precious: warmth, light, and the illusion of grandeur. A dock worker living in a candlelit room with 6 other men in an overcrowded rookery could step off a filthy street and into a gaslit palace of mirrors and carved wood, and for the price of a glass of gin, feel briefly that he belonged to a better world. Society ladies, meanwhile, reportedly sipped their gin in teacups, maintaining the pretense of tea. The Gin Palace made no judgments. It served anyone who could pay. By the late 1840s, there were more than 5,000 gin palaces in the London area alone, and this was before the absorption of areas like Kensington and Mayfair, which were still essentially rural villages. Gin palaces attracted imbibers of all backgrounds: clerks, shopkeepers, artists, women, though often served in separate areas, and working-class labourers. The appeal was near universal. If you are finding this worth your time, subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and there are centuries of London still waiting to be told. The Gin Palace attracted customers. It also attracted fury. Gin palaces became immediate flashpoints for moral panic among the middle and upper classes, the clergy, and politicians. James Silk Buckingham, a Member of Parliament and temperance campaigner, warned that endemic gin drinking would produce a fiery flood of disease, of crime, and of physical and mental destruction. The satirist George Cruikshank depicted gin palaces as gateways to ruin in his 1847 etching series, The Bottle. Some temperance writers compared gin palaces to prostitutes, describing them as seducing and entrapping the irresolute and unwary. Magistrates threatened licence revocations. Journalists wrote about the threat to public morals with inexhaustible energy. The consensus among the powerful was that the Gin Palace exercised a fatal fascination, and that it was promoting alcoholism and criminality among the working class. The controversy fed directly into legislation. The Licensing Acts of 1869 and 1872 delivered the decisive blow. The Wine and Beer House Act of 1869 ended the free trade in beer that had existed since the Beer Act of 1830. Beer houses now required standard licences and had to sell a full range of beverages. The sharp distinction between beer houses and gin palaces dissolved overnight. The Licensing Act of 1872 tightened restrictions on opening hours and expanded the powers of magistrates. Together, these acts marked a fundamental shift. The laissez-faire era was over. The state now accepted the principle of direct intervention in the drinking trade, and the gin palace, as a distinct category of establishment, began its slow extinction. The Victorian pub emerged as the dominant drinking space after 1869, inheriting elements from both gin palaces and beer houses. Magistrates actively resisted gin palace aesthetics in new licence applications, preferring plain, undecorated designs on the grounds that ornate premises encouraged drunkenness. The architectural legacy of the gin palace survived regardless. The island bar counter, originally the gin palace shop counter adapted for swift service. The etched glass panels, the mahogany fittings, the mirrors, all of it was absorbed into the new Victorian pub. Brewers increasingly adopted the tied house model, lending money to landlords for renovations in exchange for exclusive supply contracts. Power shifted from distillers to brewers. The gin palace was fading. Its ghost was everywhere. And while the gin palace declined as a building, gin itself was being transformed. The coffee still, patented in 1831, had taken decades to fully reshape the market. By the second half of the 19th century, distillers were producing far purer spirits than the rough sweetened gins of the gin craze era. By the end of the century, a drier, juniper-forward, unsweetened style was eclipsing Old Tom in popularity. The fashion for dry champagne in England partly drove this shift in taste. The style that became known as London Dry Gin was perfected in this period and remains the dominant gin style globally today. The late 19th century was actually the peak of British pub building, a paradox given the simultaneous rise of temperance politics. Opulently decorated pubs, directly inheriting the gin palace aesthetic, were constructed in enormous numbers. These are the buildings that come to mind when anyone hears the word pub. The etched glass, the mahogany, the tiles, the mirrors, all of it originated in gin palaces that have long since been demolished. The Viaduct Tavern on Newgate Street, which opened in 1869 directly across from the Old Bailey and was remodelled around 1898 by the architect Arthur Dixon, embodies this transition perfectly. Named after the Holborn Viaduct, completed the same year, the pub sits on the site once occupied by the old Newgate Prison, which was demolished in 1904. Its carved mahogany island bar, coloured etched glass clear story panels, mosaic floor reading The Viaduct, and original gaslight style chandeliers, now electrified, survive largely intact. It is one of fewer than a dozen original or near-original gin palace style establishments remaining anywhere in London. The term gin palace itself had migrated by this point. It came to describe any pub built in the lavish late Victorian style, even those that no longer primarily served gin. Then came the war, and with it, the end of the all-day gin palace in all but name. The Defence of the Realm Act, known as DORA, was passed on the 8th of August 1914, and it gave the government sweeping powers to control every aspect of civilian life. By spring 1915, those powers had been turned directly on the pub. Opening hours were slashed to roughly 5.5 hours on weekdays, down from 16 or 17 hours before the war. Alcohol was watered down. Buying rounds of drinks was made illegal, a measure known as the ban on treating, designed to reduce the social pressure to drink excessively. The strength of beer was reduced. David Lloyd George, the Minister of Munitions and a committed teetotaler, drove the policy. He called drink a greater enemy than the Germans. The restrictions were explicitly designed to keep munitions factory workers sober and productive. The old world of the all-day gin palace, where a man could drink from dawn until midnight, was over. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains how deeply those wartime measures reshaped British drinking culture. The afternoon closing requirement, the forced gap between the lunchtime session and the evening session, remained in law for more than 7 decades after the war ended. A temporary wartime measure outlasted 2 more wars, the dissolution of the British Empire and the entire space age, before anyone got around to repealing it. The Second World War inflicted physical damage that legislation never had. The Blitz devastated London. The bombing campaign damaged at least 1.7 million properties and completely destroyed approximately 70,000 structures. Many Victorian pubs, including Gin Palace survivors, were among the casualties. The Argyle Arms near Oxford Circus is notable for possessing large mirrors that survived the Blitz intact. Its survival was exceptional, not typical. Post-war redevelopment compounded the losses. Urban clearance schemes and road widening projects in the 1950s, 60s and 70s demolished significant numbers of Victorian pub buildings that had endured the bombs. And the losses did not stop in the 20th century. The Carlton Tavern in Maida Vale, built in 1921 and the only building in its street to survive the Blitz, was illegally demolished by a property development firm who acted without the required 6 weeks' notice. Westminster Council ordered the building to be reconstructed brick by brick. The impulse to destroy these buildings, it seems, outlasted even the bombs. Meanwhile, gin itself was dying as a fashionable drink. By the 1960s, its image was, as one trade publication described it, dusty, middle-aged and suburban, compared to the urban modernity of vodka. By the end of the 20th century, only Beefeater still produced gin within the M25. Gordon's Gin, founded in 1769 and the world's best-selling London Dry since the late 19th century, moved its British production from Goswell Road in London to Leindon in Essex in 1984, then to Fife in Scotland in 1998. The gin capital of the world was no longer making its definitive gin. And what of the buildings themselves? None of London's original gin palaces survive. Thompson and Fearon's was demolished in 1860. No building from the founding generation of gin palaces remains standing. What does survive are pubs built in the later Victorian tradition with gin palace design DNA running through them. The Princess Louise in Holborn, built in 1872 with its original snob screens, ceramic and marble tiling and ornate mirrors. The Argyle Arms near Oxford Circus, its large Victorian mirrors having miraculously survived the Blitz. The Prince Alfred in Maida Vale, possessing a complete surviving set of snob screens. The Salisbury on St Martin's Lane, the Punch Tavern on Fleet Street with its glazed cupola and original bar fittings. And the finest surviving example of all, outside London entirely, the Crown Liquor Saloon on Great Victoria Street in Belfast, owned by the National Trust since a full restoration in 1982. These buildings are not gin palaces. They are the children of gin palaces, and they are all that is left. The story might have ended there. A spirit in decline, its buildings erased, its legacy absorbed into pubs that no longer bore its name. It would have been a clean, melancholy ending. It did not end there. The seeds of the modern gin revival had been planted years earlier than anyone realised at the time. Bombay Sapphire, which had launched in 1987, and Hendrick's, which followed in 1999, had been quietly pioneering premium and specialist gin categories, slowly rebuilding the spirit's prestige. On the 20th of February 2008, new EU spirit drink regulations recognised and legislated 3 distinct gin definitions, providing a regulatory framework that legitimised the craft movement and encouraged investment. And then, in 2009, something happened that would have seemed almost unthinkable a decade earlier. Sam Galsworthy and Fairfax Hall, with master distiller Jared Brown, opened Sipsmith in Hammersmith. It was the first copper pot distillery in London in nearly 200 years. The last one had operated around 1820, nearly 2 centuries of silence. Getting there required 18 months of negotiations with the British government. The Gin Act of 1751, the same law that had ended the gin craze, still contained a provision requiring stills to have a minimum capacity of 1,800 litres. A law written to crush backstreet gin sellers in the age of Hogarth was still preventing a legitimate craft distillery from operating in the age of the internet. That bureaucratic relic had outlasted the buildings it was designed to regulate by 2 centuries. It had outlasted the empire that administered it. Sipsmith navigated around the restriction. Their first batch poured from a copper pot still named Prudence, designed by Christian Karl, Germany's oldest still manufacturer, on the 14th of March 2009. Hundreds of micro-distilleries opened across the United Kingdom in the years that followed. Sipsmith was acquired by Suntory Global Spirits in December 2016, but the craft gin movement it ignited was already far beyond any single distillery. London was distilling gin again, in small batches from copper stills, for the first time in nearly 200 years. London now hosts dozens of gin distilleries. The craft gin movement has explicitly invoked the gin palace aesthetic. Victorian decor, theatrical bar design, long lists of botanicals, the spectacle of the copper still itself on display behind the bar. Modern gin bars housing 500 or more gins have brought the gin palace concept into the 21st century. These places emphasise discovery, knowledge and craft, a very long way from the standing room only, 6-penny a dram establishments of the 1830s. The format has changed beyond recognition. The instinct behind it, making gin into spectacle, has not changed at all. The Gin Palace was never merely a bar. It was a social mirror, reflecting the contradictions of Industrial Revolution London back at itself. Extreme poverty beside theatrical grandeur, moral panic beside democratic pleasure, working class desperation beside genuine community. The buildings are gone. Every last one of the originals has been demolished, bombed, or quietly redeveloped into something else. The temperance campaigners, the licensing magistrates, the blitz, and the bulldozers did their work thoroughly. And yet, walk into the Princess Louise on a Tuesday evening and look around. The snob screens, the etched glass, the mahogany, the mirrors. Every one of those details was born in a gin palace that no longer exists, designed to dazzle people who could not afford to be dazzled anywhere else. The building is gone. What it taught us about how a bar should look and how a drink should feel is still right there in front of you if you know where to look.